In a packed courtroom, where power dynamics always tilt away from young black lives, a 17-year-old boy stands accused, dismissed and belittled by a seasoned white judge with a harsh gavel and a sharper tongue. But when he dares to speak, not in rebellion, but with articulate fire, he doesn't protest with emotion. He calmly repeats her own legal ruling, word for word. The courtroom goes silent. The gavel never falls again. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The mahogany benches were polished, but no amount of varnish could hide the cracks in justice that had long run through courtroom 3B. It was the kind of space where history didn't just hang in the air, it pressed down on you. The paintings of old judges, all white and all stern, stared from the walls like ghosts who never left. The fluorescent lights above cast a sterile glare on the dark wooden floor, exposing nothing and everything at once. This was a place not built for grace, but for order, and for some, for fear. A hush fell as the courtroom filled. The bailiff's voice, dry and routine, echoed, "All rise." But not everyone rose with respect. Some did so with exhaustion, some with resentment. Some didn't rise at all, just shifted in their seats like prisoners of habit. The audience was mostly black and brown. Mothers gripping purses, grandfathers with weathered hats pressed to their chests, young boys with hair braided tight and eyes wide. Judge Marlene Whitmore entered like a storm, bottled in robes. At 58, she still moved with rigid authority, heels clicking sharply against the floor. Her short silver blonde hair framed a face carved from conviction and history, not empathy. Her mouth rarely smiled in court. When it did, it meant something costly had just been decided. A child of conservative roots and a fierce believer in personal responsibility, she had built her name on being unshakable in sentencing, especially when it came to black youth, masked in phrases like repeat risk and community protection. She didn't speak as she took her seat. She didn't need to. The sound of the gavel resting on the bench did enough. It was like a trigger. Conversations died. Feet stopped shuffling. Even coughs were swallowed. Judge Whitmore glanced down at the docket in front of her and adjusted her glasses. Case number 298, 44B. State of Pennsylvania versus Omari Graves. The name rolled out slowly, like a verdict itself. The doors at the back creaked open. A hush deeper than the first settled as Omari Graves stepped forward, escorted by 2 deputies. He was 17, but already bore the exhaustion of a man twice his age. His school uniform, navy blazer, beige slacks, was wrinkled, dirtied from the night in holding. His wrists were bound with thick silver cuffs, too large for his lean frame, and every step forward was measured, not from fear, but from defiance carefully disguised as calm. He didn't scan the room. He didn't look at the cameras tucked behind press credentials. He didn't even look at Judge Whitmore. His eyes remained low, focused on the wooden floor beneath his feet, memorizing every knot and scratch as if it might mean something later. But the calmness wasn't emptiness. It was a dam, holding back what no one yet expected. His mother sat 3 rows back, her hand clenched around a tissue, lips trembling. She hadn't slept, not since the phone call came in. "Your son's been arrested." She was still wearing her scrubs from the hospital shift she left early, still wearing her badge like it could protect him somehow, as if decades of honest work could outweigh 2 minutes of injustice. Omari was made to stand behind the defendant's table. The chair remained empty. His lawyer, a young public defender named Shaw, was late again. It didn't matter. Whitmore rarely cared what public defenders had to say anyway. "Mr. Graves," she began, tone sharp and void of pretense, "you're charged with obstruction of justice, resisting arrest, and unlawful possession of a controlled substance." There was no reaction from Omari. Not a twitch, not a blink. The charges were lies. Dressed-up versions of a routine stop turned hostile, of suspicion turned assumption. He'd been walking home from tutoring. A taillight from a passing patrol car lit his backpack. That was all it took. An officer saw movement, assumed intent, escalated force. And now, here he stood, a straight-A student made criminal, in under 2 minutes. Whitmore continued. "The court has reviewed the preliminary evidence, including the officer's report, and the statements taken at the scene. Do you understand the charges brought against you?" Omari nodded, softly. "Yes, Your Honor." His voice was clear, controlled, no quiver. But it wasn't submission. It was something else, a quiet clarity. Whitmore leaned slightly forward, eyeing him. "I read in your file that you attend Langston Preparatory. Honor student. Good attendance. Your grades are impressive." A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom, some of it hope, some of it disbelief. Was she softening? Then came the blow. "But excellence in the classroom does not excuse delinquency in the streets. I've seen this too many times. Good students making bad choices. You're not special, Mr. Graves. You're just next." Silence. Tight, bitter silence. Omari lifted his head. Just slightly. Not defiantly, but with purpose. And still he said nothing. The bailiff handed the judge a folder. She opened it, scanning a page, then looked back at Omari. There's a plea deal on the table. 2 years probation. Community service and drug counseling. More murmurs. His mother's eyes widened. Whitmore tapped her gavel gently, commanding stillness. I'd recommend you take it. Trials can be unpredictable. Omari glanced at the empty chair beside him. No lawyer, no shield, and yet no fear. He opened his mouth as if to speak. Before he could, Whitmore's voice cracked through the room like a whip. Sit down and be quiet. The gavel slammed. The courtroom flinched. But Omari didn't sit. Not yet. The judge's face tensed, expecting submission. But Omari, still calm, looked up directly, not with disrespect, but with something far more unsettling to her. Knowledge. Omari stood tall, his spine straight, arms still cuffed in front of him. He hadn't moved since the gavel slammed down, since Judge Whitmore barked for silence and submission. He just stood there, a calm refusal etched across his face. Not rebellion, not arrogance, just a boy who had learned too early that when the world tries to define you, sometimes your only weapon is not moving at all. The judge's eyes narrowed. He had heard her. Everyone had. But Omari's gaze, unwavering and eerily composed, unsettled something beneath her stern exterior. She leaned back slowly in her chair, lips tight, and motioned for the bailiff to seat him. The moment passed, but it lingered, like a question left unanswered. As Omari sat, the weight of the courtroom didn't lift from him. It grew heavier. But the weight didn't begin here. It started 3 nights ago. It was late past 10 p.m. Omari had just finished tutoring at the community center on Holman Street. His bike chain had snapped earlier that week, so he was walking. Langston Prep's dark blue hoodie hugged his shoulders, and a spiral-bound notebook peeked from the side of his backpack. His earbuds played low jazz, Coltrane, or maybe Miles. He couldn't remember. All he knew was that the street was quiet, and the air cold enough to see his breath. He didn't see the cruiser until the headlights curved around the block, slow and deliberate. He kept walking, eyes forward, posture unthreatening. Because that's what you do when you're 17 and black in the wrong part of town after dark. You make yourself small, uninteresting. But the cruiser didn't pass. It slowed. Then it stopped. The spotlight clicked on. A voice crackled from the speaker. Hands where we can see 'em. Omari froze, raised his hands. He wasn't scared, not yet. This had happened before too many times to him, to his friends, to boys who lived on the same street. Some stops ended in shrugs, others in cuffs. All of them ended in humiliation. The officers stepped out. 2 white men, one younger, buzz-cut hand already on his holster. The other older, barrel-chested, barking questions before he was within arm's reach.
What are you doing out here?
Where you headed?
Why are you sweating? Been running? Omari tried to answer. Polite, clear, steady. But each word seemed to make them angrier. One officer grabbed his arm. The other yanked off his backpack. Papers spilled. His pen rolled under the squad car. You got drugs in here, huh? No, sir, Omari said, softly. Just homework. They didn't ask permission. They didn't wait for a reason. They dumped the contents of his bag onto the hood. Books, a calculator, a half-eaten granola bar. No drugs. Nothing illegal. Just pieces of a life he was building, now scattered under the cold stare of red and blue lights. But then came the lie. The younger cop reached into his pocket, pulled something out. A plastic baggie, white residue clinging to its edges. Looks like intent to distribute, he said. Omari blinked. That's not mine. Wrong answer. They slammed him onto the hood, cuffed him, called it resisting, claimed he tensed up. No dashcam footage ever surfaced. The officers filed a report within the hour. Narrative set. And just like that, a college-bound teen became case 29-44B. Back in the courtroom, Omari's public defender finally arrived, late, disheveled, the weight of dozens of similar cases on his shoulders. His name was Marcus Shaw, and though he tried, even he knew he was outmatched, underfunded, overworked, doomed. He slid into the seat beside Omari and whispered something apologetic. Omari nodded but said nothing. There was nothing to apologize for that hadn't already been done to them, both by a system with no face, just policies. Shaw addressed the judge but with no real conviction. Your Honor, we intend to challenge the evidence. There are inconsistencies in the police report. There's reason to believe. Whitmore cut him off. You'll have your chance. For now, let's proceed. Omari's mother sat silently behind them, fists clenched in her lap. Her name was Nina Graves, and she'd worked 13-hour shifts at St. Luke's Medical for over a decade. She had cleaned blood from trauma rooms, held dying hands during the worst nights of COVID, and comforted strangers with the same voice she once sang lullabies to her son with. She had raised Omari alone since he was 5, since his father disappeared into a sentence that was longer than the crime ever deserved. She had told herself it wouldn't happen again. Her son would be different, untouchable, educated, loved. But in America, even straight-A students get dragged down by shadows they never cast. Her eyes didn't blink as she stared at Judge Whitmore. She wanted her to see her, not just another black mother in another courtroom pew, but a woman whose entire existence was being shattered from the inside out. Again. The worst part wasn't just the charges. It was the footage. Or rather, the absence of it. Nina had called every office she could find, asked for the dash cam, the body cam, the street camera footage. She filed requests, waited, prayed. Finally, she received a letter. Due to a technical malfunction, the recording for incident 4457A cannot be recovered. The words felt surgical, designed to drain hope cleanly, without mess. But Nina knew better. Malfunction didn't explain why the incident right before and right after had footage intact. It didn't explain why the streetlight camera, maintained by the city, also reported uncaptured data during the exact window of the arrest. It wasn't a glitch. It was a choice. Someone had chosen to erase her son, and she couldn't prove it. That night, after the preliminary hearing, Nina returned home to find the house empty, quiet except for the ticking of the hallway clock. She dropped her bag, peeled off her coat, and collapsed into the living room sofa. She didn't cry. Not yet. She couldn't. She had cried enough in hospitals, in bathrooms, in courtrooms where justice was too quiet. But as she reached for a tissue from the coffee table, her hand stopped. There was a book there, one she didn't recognize. A thick leather-bound legal volume. Federal Juvenile Sentencing Precedents 2002-2015. She furrowed her brow, flipped it open. The pages were marked, underlined. Notes scribbled in blue ink. Omari's handwriting. She hadn't seen this book before. She hadn't bought it. Yet here it was, waiting for her. Her fingers trembled as she turned another page and saw Judge Whitmore's name, highlighted under a 2012 ruling that read, "In cases where youthful potential outweighs criminal impulse, we are not tasked with punishment, but with possibility." Her breath caught. Omari had found her ruling. She stared at the page, realization blooming like fire. Her son was preparing for something bigger than survival. He was planning to fight, not with fists, but with her words. Nina turned the page again. Omari's handwriting curled along the margin in sharp, deliberate loops. The underlined phrases weren't just highlights, they were patterns, observations, questions, a quiet war plan. She traced the ink with her finger like it was scripture, stunned not only by the content, but by the sheer depth of it. Her son had studied Judge Marlene Whitmore's past, not out of fear, but out of strategy. She had once told him, after a fight at school, "Don't raise your voice, raise your value." He had listened, more than she realized. Omari's education had started long before his arrest, in a place where most teens his age found boredom, the local library on Charleston and 8th, while others buried themselves in gaming forums or TikTok. Omari buried himself in appellate court briefs. His curiosity began after a class debate where he defended the case of Gideon v. Wainwright, the landmark ruling that gave the accused the right to legal counsel. While others had skimmed the syllabus, he'd memorized the arguments. His teacher had given him extra credit, but Omari didn't care about the grade. He cared about the logic. He found something in law that no classroom could offer, language that could not only explain injustice, but dismantle it. He began photocopying case files, taking out dense legal texts, scouring them with a highlighter like he was preparing for war. He wrote names in the margins: Thurgood Marshall, Sonia Sotomayor, Brian Stevenson, and one name circled more than once: J. Elwood Payne, a relatively obscure federal circuit judge from the 1990s, whose dissenting opinions were rarely quoted, but deeply human. It was Payne who had once written, "Justice that silences is no justice at all." Omari had copied that quote onto the inside of his notebook cover. He looked at it every morning before school, every night before bed. It became his mantra, and eventually his motive. The day after he was released on bond, before the preliminary hearing, Nina found him at the kitchen table, hoodie up, earbuds in, pen in hand. He wasn't sketching or journaling, he was outlining. Not a defense, but an argument, a debate, a presentation. She watched him from the hallway, saying nothing, realizing only then He wasn't preparing to survive court. He was preparing to command it. Omari treated the courtroom like a final round of a national debate, not because he wanted to prove he was right, but because he knew something rare, that words, if delivered right, could shatter assumptions faster than fists. His mind was an arsenal of precedents. Brownview Board of Education, the foundation of racial equality in education. Terry v. Ohio, the case that legalized stop and frisk, and the gateway to racial profiling. Batson v. Kentucky, the battle against racial discrimination in jury selection. He could quote each ruling's majority opinion. But more importantly, he understood the dissents, the voices that spoke against the tide, knowing they'd lose. He related more to the losing side, not because they were wrong, but because they were often right too early. In his room, he had built a wall of index cards, each labeled with a judge's name, case title, and quote. One card read, "Punishment without recognition is merely cruelty." Another, "Silence is consent to injustice." That card had Judge Whitmore's initials beside it. She'd written those words in 2012, in a ruling where she'd granted clemency to a white teen charged with felony vandalism, citing his academic excellence, stable home, and youthful promise. Omari had read it 5 times, then again, then again. He didn't just study her logic, he studied her language, how she structured mercy, and to whom she gave it. It wasn't lost on him that every case where she'd extended leniency looked like her grandson. He didn't hate her for it. He just refused to accept it. The courtroom wasn't a place for him to plead. It was a place for her to listen. But there was a deeper layer to Omari's study, something he hadn't shared with anyone. Not his mother. Not even his closest friend, Isaiah, who once joked, "Bro, you gonna be a judge before you even see college." Omari had smiled, but the truth was heavier. He had always feared this day would come. Not this exact arrest, not this exact courtroom, but the inevitability of being reduced to a threat. He saw it happen to others. Brilliant boys, creative girls, all turned invisible by the same slow machinery, and so he prepared, like someone learning how to breathe underwater before being thrown into a river. He didn't want to be just another case. He wanted to be the interruption. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it was designed, but design could be disrupted, if you knew how. And Omari knew. That night, just hours before the final hearing was to begin, he sat at the edge of his bed. A small lamp glowed beside him, casting soft light on the pages scattered around him. Legal briefs, notes, quotes, and one single yellow notebook, his script. He had written out every word he planned to say, line by line, annotated with possible objections, cued to her past rulings. It wasn't showmanship, it was precision. He wasn't asking to be freed, he was demanding to be seen. Nina walked past the room, paused at the door. "You okay, baby?" Omari didn't look up. "Yeah." She stepped in, picked up one of the papers. Her eyes skimmed the text, but couldn't make sense of all of it. Too dense, too legal. He noticed her confusion. "It's what she said," he whispered. "It's all what she said. I'm just reminding her." Nina felt a chill crawl up her spine. He didn't speak with hope. He spoke with intent. She'd never been prouder, and never more terrified. Later, after she had gone to bed, Omari stared at the final page of his notebook, a handwritten closing statement. It ended with a quote, not from Payne, not from Whitmore, from himself. "I am not what you see. I am what you missed when you refused to look." He held the page in his hands for a long moment. Then, without a word, he tore it out and fed it to the flame of the desk lamp's bulb. The next morning, when Nina came to wake him, the notebook was gone. All that remained on his pillow was a single card, the quote from Judge Whitmore's 2012 ruling, folded, unburned. The bench in courtroom 3B had always felt more like a fortress than a seat, and for nearly 3 decades, Judge Marlene Whitmore had ruled from it like a monarch cloaked in law, austere, immovable, and resolute. Her voice carried the finality of a slammed door, and when she spoke, the room bent to her rhythm. But behind the veneer of legal decorum, there was a pattern, a quiet, consistent storm that had been building over years of rulings, unchecked and unchallenged. Her career had begun with promise. Fresh out of law school in 1991, Whitmore was celebrated as a trailblazer, one of the youngest women appointed to the juvenile bench in Pennsylvania. At first, she had been idealistic, even compassionate in her sentencing. But the turning point came in 1998, when a group of black teens allegedly assaulted a white jogger in a nearby suburb. The media storm was relentless. Though the evidence was thin, and the trial a circus of racial hysteria, Whitmore presided over the case like she had something to prove. not just to the law but to the public. She handed down the maximum sentence to each teen. No plea deals, no second chances. The community praised her. Headlines read, "Judge Whitmore delivers justice without mercy." It became her brand. But that tough justice wasn't distributed equally. In the years that followed, her sentencing patterns began to emerge like a bruise under glass. Black teens charged with petty crimes, shoplifting, possession, curfew violations, were met with disproportionate punishment. Meanwhile, white defendants with similar or worse records often walked away with probation, counseling, or community service. To most, it was just the way things were. To others, it was racial bias thinly veiled in professionalism. But to her clerks, especially the ones who stayed late, who read between her red ink annotations, and studied the language she wielded like a scalpel, it was unmistakable. One former clerk, who requested anonymity out of fear of professional backlash, spoke in hushed tones to a freelance journalist covering judicial bias in youth courts. She never saw them as kids, the clerk said. Just futures she didn't want to see unfold. The clerk recalled one case in particular, a 15-year-old black boy named Keon Walters, arrested for stealing headphones from a mall kiosk. First-time offense, honor roll student. He cried during the hearing, asked for forgiveness. Whitmore gave him 12 months in a juvenile facility and told him, "If you start stealing at 15, you'll be breaking into homes by 18. No restorative programs, no mentorship, just a sentence." In contrast, 3 months later, she presided over the case of a white teen, Jordan Helston, who had been caught with a stolen laptop and a stash of prescription pills not belonging to him. Whitmore offered him diversion, told him in a courtroom recorded transcript, "You're not a criminal. You're a kid who lost his way." 2 boys, same city, same system, different skin. No one had ever confronted her on the record. No one could. Her record was too clean, her defenses too well rehearsed. She wasn't overtly racist. She never used slurs. She treated everyone equally, in her own words. But equality, when built on different expectations, becomes its own kind of cruelty. She justified it in private chambers. "Some kids are simply more likely to reoffend," she once told a young intern. "It's not racism, it's realism." But realism had numbers, and the numbers told a different story. Of the 217 juvenile cases she presided over in a 10-year span, 72% of black teens received custodial sentences, while only 24% of white teens did, despite similar charges and records. The data was buried in quarterly reports. No one compiled it. No one questioned it. It was just the system breathing as it always had. Until Omari. He had dug deep into archives, municipal databases, and backlogged case records that were never meant to be revisited. He found transcripts, court briefs, local newspaper clippings, every ruling with her name attached. He created a spreadsheet, organized by race, charge, age, and outcome. But one case stood out. Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus Carter Williams, 20. A white teen, 17, caught with prescription pills, marijuana, and charged with resisting arrest after allegedly shoving an officer. The charges had matched his own. But the result? Dismissed felony, expunged record, community service, and in her own handwritten judgment. This court recognizes the potential in young people, especially those with demonstrated academic promise, and seeks not to punish, but to redirect. Omari read that sentence 3 times. Then he printed it. Then he memorized it. It was the exact language Judge Whitmore had denied him, word for word. He didn't hate her for it, but he saw her, finally, clearly, and seeing her made everything sharper, every biased pause in court, every dismissive tone, every refusal to make eye contact with his mother. That ruling wasn't just inconsistent. It was the blueprint of her belief. She believed in potential, when it looked like her. But Omari didn't intend to confront her with emotion. He planned to confront her with her own words, her own mercy, weaponized, a mirror, polished and deadly. He tucked the ruling into a folder marked defense prep, not for his lawyer, for himself. It was his closing argument, not in anger, in revelation. In the middle of the night, as streetlights painted stripes across his wall, Omari recited the paragraph under his breath like scripture. This court recognizes the potential. Each word fell from his lips not as hope but as warning. He wouldn't beg. He would remind her, and in doing so force the courtroom, the system, to see the truth they'd all conveniently blurred. Omari folded the ruling, placed it into his pocket, and stared at the ceiling. In the silence, a question haunted him. If she hears her own words, will she recognize them, or will she deny they were ever hers? The courtroom didn't hum that morning. It pulsed. A low, tense energy vibrated through the woodwork and concrete like it was alive and waiting to exhale. Even the walls seemed to listen, aware something different was about to unfold inside their old, cold silence. There were more people in the gallery than usual. Reporters scribbled notes with restless pens, their badges swinging from lanyards. A court artist sharpened a fresh pencil, scanning the room with the eye of someone who knew drama was guaranteed. Camera lenses peeked through the courtroom windows, their flashes banned, but their presence felt. Word had spread, subtly but surely, that today's case, the State versus Omari Graves, wasn't going to be routine. It had all the ingredients for a headline: a brilliant black student, a seasoned conservative judge, racial tension dressed as legality, and now the whisper of an unexpected defense. Omari sat at the defense table, hands folded, spine straight, eyes forward. No cuffs today. But his hands were still bound by something deeper, the knowledge that any misstep would feed the very narrative they were waiting to confirm. He wasn't nervous, not visibly, but his fingers tapped an unseen rhythm against the table's edge, a silent beat he'd been counting in his head since he woke. His mother, Nina, sat behind him, her hands clenched in her lap like stone. She wore a gray cardigan and no makeup, her tired eyes red but dry. She hadn't cried this morning. She couldn't afford to, not with the world watching. Judge Marlene Whitmore entered through the side door, her black robe moving like a shadow across her frame. The courtroom rose. She didn't acknowledge them, didn't scan faces. She only glanced briefly toward the prosecution table, then toward Omari. She adjusted her glasses, then her tone cut through the stillness like glass across tile. This court will now reconvene in the matter of State of Pennsylvania versus Omari Graves. As everyone sat, a low creak echoed from the old wooden benches. It was the sound of a city settling into confrontation. Whitmore cleared her throat and peered down over her glasses. Mr. Graves, you've been advised, by both your counsel and this court, that a plea deal has been offered. 2 years of probation, 250 hours of community service, and enrollment in a court-approved rehabilitation program. She paused, letting the offer hang in the air like bait. Before we proceed to trial, she continued, I will ask you one final time. Do you accept this offer? The gallery held its breath. Omari didn't blink. No, Your Honor. A ripple moved through the crowd, subtle but undeniable. Some gasped. A reporter's pen paused mid-word. Nina closed her eyes, breathing in something thick and ancient, fear wrapped in pride. Whitmore leaned back, her face hardening. You understand the consequences of declining this offer? Yes, Omari replied evenly. You understand that if found guilty, the charges against you carry a maximum sentence of 5 years? Yes, Your Honor. She set her pen down with a soft clink. Then explain to this court why you would choose a trial, why you would gamble your future, your freedom, when the alternative is leniency and closure. Her voice was louder now, controlled but agitated. There was something in Omari's defiance that irritated her deeper than usual. He wasn't hostile. He wasn't scared. He was composed, and that was unsettling. Omari looked up. Not with arrogance, not with rage, with clarity. I'm not here for mercy, he said, voice steady. And I'm not here to gamble. Whitmore cocked her head slightly. Then what are you here for? Omari didn't rush his answer. He let the silence stretch, just long enough to draw every ear toward him. I'm here for precedent. The room froze. One of the reporters dropped their pen. Whitmore narrowed her eyes. Excuse me. There it was. The shift. The moment the storm began to change direction, Omari didn't flinch. I don't want a lighter sentence, he said calmly. I want the same consideration that was given to Carter Williams in 2012. Same age, same charge, different skin. The name hit like a slap. Whitmore blinked. Hard. She reached for the file in front of her but didn't open it. Her fingers stiffened, her jaw flexed. I'm sorry, what did you say? Omari folded his hands neatly in front of him, his voice unshaken. I'm referencing your ruling in Commonwealth v. Williams. You said, and I quote, this court recognizes the potential in young people, especially those with demonstrated academic promise, and seeks not to punish but to redirect. Gasps, audible this time. Omari continued, now looking directly into her eyes. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for consistency. The law, Your Honor. Your law, applied equally. The silence was no longer passive. It was haunted. Whitmore's gavel hovered above her desk, but she didn't strike it. Her hand had stopped midair, as though frozen between duty and disbelief. Her mouth parted slightly, words forming but refusing to emerge. In the second row, a reporter mouthed to her colleague, Did he just quote her ruling? Marcus Shaw, Omari's public defender, looked equally stunned, not because Omari was wrong, but because no defendant in his career had ever gone there. That deep, that bold, that correct. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably near the door. Whitmore leaned forward, finally breaking her paralysis.
How did you gain access to sealed juvenile rulings?
Omari shrugged. They weren't sealed, just buried. Public record if you know where to look. The gallery started murmuring again. Whitmore tapped the gavel once, not with her usual force. It was restrained, almost mechanical. Order in the court, she said, quieter than expected. Omari kept speaking. You called him a lost boy, said he deserved redirection. I'm asking why that same language doesn't apply to me. Whitmore exhaled through her nose, her composure thinning. You are not the judge here. No, Omari replied, but I am the one on trial, and I have the right to question the fairness of the process being used against me. From the back of the room, a woman whispered, This kid's gonna change something. A man next to her whispered back, If they let him. Whitmore leaned back in her chair. You are dangerously close to contempt. Omari didn't retreat, no closer than you were to compassion in 217 cases just like mine.
That landed. Hard.
Nina gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. She hadn't known the full number. She hadn't known her son had counted them. But Omari had, every last one. Whitmore's face twitched, a micro-expression of something close to recognition, or fear. Are you suggesting this court is biased? She asked. I'm not suggesting, Omari replied. I'm presenting evidence. He reached into his folder, pulled a single sheet of paper, and held it aloft. Here's a list of 20 cases you presided over in the past 10 years. All black defendants. All under 18. All first-time offenders. The average sentence, 18 months. Another paper. Here are 20 white defendants. Similar charges, similar ages, similar circumstances. The average sentence, 6 months. Often suspended. The courtroom was now electric. Even the court reporter had paused typing, her fingers frozen above the keys. Whitmore stared at the papers, but didn't ask for them. She didn't need to. She knew. She had written them. And now for the first time she was hearing them from someone she had already written off. A long pause followed. Whitmore adjusted her robe. I will review your statements during recess, she said, her voice low and measured. There won't be a recess, Omari said. She blinked. Excuse me? Omari slowly stood. You said trials are unpredictable. That's true. But silence is predictable, and I'm not here to be predictable. Shaw tugged his sleeve. Omari. But Omari didn't sit. Not yet. He turned to face the gallery. I'm not here to prove I'm innocent. I'm here to prove that justice isn't blind. It's selective. And I'm done pretending that's okay. Murmurs turned to light applause. Soft, nervous, but real. Whitmore's face went pale. She slammed the gavel. That's enough. But it wasn't. It wasn't even close. As Whitmore opened her mouth to regain control, Omari reached into his pocket and pulled out the original printed ruling from her 2012 case. Highlighted, annotated, her handwriting still faintly visible. He placed it on the defense table, without a word, without fear, and then locked eyes with her once more. The courtroom was no longer just a space. It had become a crucible. Heat radiated off bodies, not from temperature, but tension. Every eye was on Omari, not the judge, not the prosecution, him. He stood still, the paper still on the table before him. Judge Whitmore's own 2012 ruling, annotated and highlighted in yellow, her name circled twice in ink so firm it almost tore the page. Judge Whitmore's eyes locked on the document like it was a threat, her lips pressed into a thin white line. Behind the bench, her hand hovered over the gavel again. Not resting, not decisive, but jittery, as if she knew any wrong move could make this spectacle permanent. Viral. Historical. Omari could feel the moment coiling tighter, like a spring winding with every silent second. Then he spoke. Your Honor, on June 12, 2012, you ruled, bang! The gavel struck the desk with a violence it hadn't before. You are out of order, Whitmore barked, her voice cracking like a whip across the room. This is not your platform. This is a courtroom. But Omari didn't sit. His voice, unshaken, cut through her fury like a slow-moving knife. This is exactly the place, and the words I'm using are yours. The gallery gasped again, louder this time. A man in the back let out a stunned whoa, before covering his mouth. Nina flinched but didn't break her gaze. She didn't move. Not an inch. Judge Whitmore rose to her feet, robe sweeping against the floor with theatrical indignation. You will sit down, she snapped, pointing sharply at the defense table like she was addressing a disobedient child. This is my courtroom. You are the defendant, not the judge. But her voice, loud as it was, could not overpower the atmosphere now heavy with shifting power. She didn't sound like a judge reclaiming order. She sounded like a woman on the verge of losing control. Omari didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice. He just kept reading, each word carved from memory. In that case, he said, you declared that a 17-year-old white male, who was caught with illegal substances and resisted arrest, should not be defined by his worst moment. You wrote, the law must see promise in youth, not threats. Whitmore slammed the gavel again. Sit down, boy. It echoed. Ugly, sharp, final. Time seemed to stop. It wasn't just the command, it was the tone. The word boy didn't sound procedural. It didn't sound professional. It sounded ancestral. It sounded like control wrapped in disdain, like a century of racial condescension rolled into 2 syllables. The court stilled. Even the reporters froze. One journalist, a black woman with her notepad halfway up, lowered her hand slowly. Her eyes didn't blink. Her jaw clenched. She knew what she'd just heard, and so did everyone else. Omari looked directly at Whitmore, eyes heavy but not surprised. He had heard that word before, not just the word but the weight of it, spoken in classrooms, in traffic stops, in offices, always as a weapon, never by accident. You don't see me as a student, he said, voice thick with clarity, or a son, or a human being. You see me as a statistic waiting to explode, because you already decided who I am. Whitmore didn't respond, couldn't. Her mouth opened, but the words didn't come.
You called me boy, Omari said, but I'm 17, and I know the law better than most adults who walk into this room. I know what precedent means. I know what due process means. I know what implicit bias does when it hides behind a robe.
A silence more powerful than sound overtook the room. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. You are dangerously close to contempt, Mr. Graves. Then let's talk about contempt, Omari said. Let's talk about the contempt you've shown for defendants who look like me. The eye rolls, the dismissive tones, the quicker gavel drops, the harsher sentences. Let's talk about how Carter Williams walked out of this room a free man because he reminded you of someone you once loved, and how I walk in with straight A's, no priors, and get offered 2 years of probation like it's generosity. The public defender Shaw sat stunned beside Omari, unsure whether to intervene or just watch the moment unfold like history. Every instinct told him to caution the boy, but something deeper told him to let him speak, because the system had already done all the talking. Whitmore's voice lowered. You are making dangerous assumptions. No, Omari said. I'm making citations. He pointed to the ruling on the table. I've read 20 of your judgments. I highlighted the language you use when you sentence black teens versus white teens. You call them threats, risks, and candidates for institutional support. You call white kids bright, troubled, and capable of growth. Another beat of silence. Then softly, almost to himself, Omari added, and somehow you think we don't read. You think we don't notice. Whitmore's face twitched again, the tiniest crack in the porcelain. The racism wasn't just in her words. It was in her body, in the way her lips curled when she said boy, in the way her eyes narrowed as if squinting made Omari smaller, in the posture she assumed when being challenged by someone darker, younger, and smarter than she expected. She had ruled over thousands, but no one had ever put her on the stand. Until now. You're playing a dangerous game, she muttered, regaining some of her edge. You think you're special because you can quote me, because you did your research? Omari didn't move. No, I don't think I'm special. I think I'm prepared. That sentence hung in the air like thunder waiting for lightning. A court clerk dropped a stapler. No one looked. Even the bailiff hesitated. And then Omari took one step forward. Not defiant, not aggressive, just firm. He placed his hand gently on the printed ruling, then raised his eyes back to the judge. You wrote these words. Justice must be blind to background, but not to circumstance. And when we forget that, we turn our courts into cages. Whitmore blinked slowly. Recognition crept across her face like a ghost from a past she had tried to bury. Those were her words. And now they were being used as a mirror. You said that, didn't you? Omari asked. She didn't answer. So he repeated it, louder, clearer. You said that. Whitmore gripped the bench, her knuckles whitening. Then something shifted. She sat back, eyes lowered. Just for a second. The courtroom waited for the next hammer to fall. But Whitmore didn't reach for the gavel. Not yet. Omari leaned in and said quietly, "So tell me, Judge, do your words only count when they come from your mouth, or do they still matter when they come from mine?" The silence in the courtroom had become suffocating. Not the quiet of respect or stillness, but the kind that pressed against walls and lungs, daring anyone to breathe too loud. The kind of silence that felt like truth had just taken a seat and was waiting to be heard. Omari stood with both hands resting lightly on the defense table, the page with Judge Whitmore's 2012 ruling resting beneath his fingertips like sacred text. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't sweating. But something in him had shifted. He wasn't just a boy defending his innocence. He had become something else, a vessel for the very system that sought to erase him, a living contradiction standing in defiance of statistical prophecy. The judge's gavel remained untouched. The gallery, frozen. Even the court reporter's hands hovered above the keyboard, her rhythm broken, unsure if this moment was real or theatrical. But it was neither. It was revelation. And Omari spoke again, low and steady, but with the resonance of someone who knew every syllable mattered. "Your Honor, on June 12, 2012, in Commonwealth versus Carter Williams, you said," he didn't need to look at the paper. He looked directly into her eyes. "This court is not in the business of caging potential, but in the service of nurturing it. When a young individual demonstrates consistent academic dedication, a stable home environment, and no history of prior offenses, it would be a failure of this institution to treat that youth as a hardened criminal." He paused, just long enough for the words to sink in. In the back, someone gasped. It wasn't dramatic. It was disbelief turned audible. The stenographer slowly resumed typing, her keystrokes hesitant, deliberate, as if her hands were translating something holy. Omari continued, inching forward with his voice. "While the offense is not excused, context matters, circumstance matters. Justice must be blind to color, but not to condition. Equity is not favoritism. It is fairness measured through understanding." Whitmore shifted in her chair. Omari saw it, the flicker in her eyes. A stutter of the soul. Recognition. She remembered. She remembered those words because she had written them in her own hand, in her own voice, with her own philosophy, one she thought was buried in a ruling no one would ever dig up, one she believed had passed without question, unchallenged, unremembered. And now, here it was, spoken back to her by the very kind of youth she had once abandoned that philosophy for. The irony cut deeper than any outburst ever could. Omari wasn't protesting. He was holding up a mirror, word for word. She cleared her throat, but the sound cracked. The robe felt heavier than usual, her chair less secure. It wasn't just the boy's calm that unnerved her. It was the precision, the strategy, the audacity. "You memorized that ruling," she said softly. Omari didn't blink. "I did." "You weren't supposed to have access to that file." "It wasn't sealed," he said. "It just wasn't convenient." The gallery murmured again. No longer passive spectators, they were witnesses to imbalance, to fragility masquerading as order. The room had changed allegiance, not legally, but spiritually, and Whitmore felt it. She reached for her water glass and took a sip, her hand visibly trembling. "Why that case?" she asked. Omari nodded slowly. "Because it was the first time I saw the law reflect mercy, and because Carter Williams and I had the same GPA, same charges, same age, but not the same judge." Whitmore flinched at that, barely, but it was there. Shaw finally broke his silence. "Your Honor, I—" Whitmore raised a hand. "No, Mr. Shaw, let him finish." Omari didn't move. He didn't need permission. He kept reciting, "The defendant shall be placed in a restorative justice program, under the supervision of the County Youth Rehabilitation Office. This court expects excellence not only in punishment, but in principle." He let the final phrase linger in the air, like a thread waiting to be pulled. "Excellence in principle. That's what you said." Whitmore stared at him, something flickering behind her eyes. Not guilt. Not yet. But memory. Her own words, once proud, now weaponized against her. She whispered more to herself than anyone. "I wrote that case 10 years ago." "And in 10 years, Omari replied, "what changed? The law? Or your lens?" That question didn't need answering. The reporter's pens scratched faster. The court sketch artist stopped drawing Whitmore's face and shifted the page to draw Omari's. The balance had shifted, not in verdict, but in voice. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This was a reckoning. Whitmore tried to reassert control. Her voice grew firmer. "You are not a licensed attorney. You are not permitted to address the court without counsel. Omari raised an eyebrow. Then consider this an education, Your Honor, because clearly we've both forgotten something. She bristled. Oh, excuse me. Omari leaned forward, slow and unwavering. So I ask you, Your Honor. The gallery leaned in. Is justice still blind? His voice softened. Or just selectively mute? The room erupted. Not in volume, but in tension. The kind that makes hearts race and eyes widen. The kind that lives in history books, quiet but permanent. Whitmore didn't slam the gavel. She couldn't. Because in that moment, she didn't own the room anymore. Omari did. And her silence was the loudest sound of all. A bailiff stepped forward toward Omari, unsure whether to stop him or salute him. But before anyone could move, Whitmore did something she had never done in 30 years on the bench. She whispered, barely audible. Court is recessed. And then she stood and walked out. Not with power, but with retreat. When Judge Whitmore stood and recessed her own courtroom without ceremony, the room did not rise, it rippled. Whispers swelled, not in chaos, but in awe. A woman who had never yielded, not to noise, not to reason, not to public pressure, had just walked out. And it hadn't been from disrespect or disorder. It had been from a boy with no badge, no degree, and no podium, just precision and truth. The silence she left behind was instantly replaced with electricity. Phones came out, almost in unison. Reporters made beelines to the exit, already drafting headlines in their heads. Microphones were raised, tensions sharpened. Everyone knew this wasn't just a moment, it was a breach. A system had been challenged on its own turf, by its own weapon, the law. Outside, the courthouse steps teemed with murmurs. News vans circled like sharks catching scent. Reporters leaned into cameras, shouting names that hadn't made headlines until now. Omari Graves, a 17-year-old Langston prep student, stood his ground today, quoted Judge Whitmore's own words back to her. The judge's sudden exit raises questions. It spread like wildfire. By the time Omari and his mother exited the courthouse quietly, through the back doors, Twitter was already flooded. Omari Graves, blind justice. Judge Whitmore expose an...
This is precedent.
Videos surfaced within the hour. Grainy courtroom sketches, witness quotes, a blurry clip of Omari standing, saying the phrase that now echoed across the country. So I ask you, Your Honor, is justice still blind, or just selectively mute? That sentence became a rallying cry. Graphics appeared on social media. Omari's silhouette beside a statue of Lady Justice, but with her blindfold slipping, the scales tipping. College students, civil rights groups, legal analysts, everyone had an opinion, but no one doubted the impact. And then came the deeper dig. Journalists, emboldened by the public frenzy, began pulling Judge Whitmore's past cases. Data analysts on Reddit compiled her sentencing records into spreadsheets. Activists dug up her remarks from old panel appearances. Within 24 hours, a detailed infographic was trending, titled, Equal Justice? Not in 3B, The Whitmore Gap. It showed the glaring disparity in tone, in sentencing, in opportunity. Omari hadn't asked for this. He hadn't prepared for the digital storm, the endless DMs, the interview requests, the celebrities retweeting him, the law professors quoting him on national television. He didn't want to be anyone's hero. He just wanted his dignity. He wanted to survive, and maybe be understood. But now, he was a symbol. The uncomfortable truth. Symbols don't get to rest. That night, Omari sat in the dark corner of his room, scrolling through his phone, the screen glowing like a stage light. He saw his face in news thumbnails. He read headlines that made him sound mythic, but also headlines that accused him of being ungrateful, radical, dangerous. He exhaled. This ain't what I wanted, he whispered. His mother, standing at the door, didn't interrupt. She knew that tone, the weight behind a boy being turned into a message before he had time to breathe as a man. I just wanted fairness, he said again. Nina stepped in, knelt in front of him. You wanted truth, she said, and you gave it. That's more than most men twice your age have ever done. He nodded slowly, not in agreement but in surrender. Across the city, protests began forming. Not violent, not chaotic, but deliberate. Law students held teach-ins on judicial bias. Community centers ran mock trials using Omari's case as curriculum. Local news ran stories titled From Defendant to Disruptor, How a Teen Forced a Judge to Listen. And then came the twist. An anonymous source leaked an internal memo, Judge Whitmore on temporary leave pending administrative review. The statement was clinical, brief and carefully worded, but it said everything. The judge who had never been questioned was now being questioned by her own institution. and the cases were being reopened. One by one. Keon Walters, Jasmine Hill, Rico Thompson. Names that had once been buried in docket numbers were now headlines of their own. Civil rights lawyers began compiling legal briefs to appeal their sentences, arguing racial bias using Omari's exposure as the foundation. But through all of it, Omari remained silent. He turned down every interview. He didn't go live on Instagram, didn't post videos, didn't write a long captioned post explaining himself. He didn't need to. He had already spoken in the only place that mattered and said what needed to be said. But that didn't stop people from reaching out. Letters poured in, emails, messages, some from strangers, some from boys like him. Smart, overlooked, black, boxed in by perception. You showed me we're not crazy. I used to think silence was safer. Not anymore. I'm gonna read my judge's rulings now, word for word. Omari read every one. He saved them. Not for validation, but for memory, so that when this moment faded, he'd remember the clarity of what he'd done. Back at the courthouse, a different scene was unfolding. Judge Whitmore sat in her private chambers, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. Her gavel lay untouched beside her legal volumes. Her face was pale, her fingers laced tightly in her lap. Her world, orderly, absolute, scripted, was cracking. And the worst part? It wasn't the media frenzy. It was that the boy hadn't been wrong. He hadn't accused her. He'd reflected her. She looked at the printed ruling he'd left behind, her own handwriting. How had he found it? How had he used it so cleanly, so powerfully? She whispered, as if someone might be listening. How did I forget I wrote that? A knock at her door broke the silence. Her clerk entered, voice cautious. There's a request to reopen Commonwealth for Carter Williams. Whitmore didn't look up. She didn't speak. The weight of her silence was finally heavy enough to matter. Outside the courthouse, a young girl no older than 12 stood holding a sign. We're not asking for justice, we're reciting it. And inside, Omari scrolled past the photo and quietly turned off his phone. Judge Marlene Whitmore sat in her chambers long after the building emptied. The courtroom lights had dimmed. The echo of gavel strikes no longer haunted the halls. But inside her mind, they rang louder than ever. Not the ones she'd cast in recent days, but thousands from her past. She could hear them now, like ghosts knocking. She hadn't eaten. Her tea had gone cold. Her desk, usually pristine, was now cluttered with files she didn't want to read. Not because they were unfamiliar. Her own handwriting haunted every margin. Her own voice echoed from transcripts. Her own judgments, sharp, certain, final. And now they felt like tombstones. The boy Omari had not yelled, had not protested. He had not made a scene. He had simply reflected her, word for word. That, she realized, was the most devastating act of all. For the first time in decades, she wasn't angry. She was afraid. Not of exposure, but of herself. 38 years earlier, Marlene had been a different woman. She remembered the clunky cassette tapes she carried in her law school bag, the sharp click of her typewriter keys as she typed essays on due process and equal protection. Back then, she wore blazers too big for her, took night classes while waiting tables, and wrote idealistic notes in the margins of her casebooks. Law must protect the smallest voice. She remembered a black professor, one of the few who once said to her during a lecture on juvenile justice, "You're smart, Miss Whitmore, but until you see the system through the eyes of those it was built against, you're only studying half the law." She had nodded. She hadn't understood. Not then. She passed the bar, made headlines as a young woman appointed to the bench, and wore that title like armor. Over time, bureaucracy chipped away at that early idealism. Budgets, politics, public pressure, backlog, violence. And one by one, she replaced her instincts with habits. She told herself sentencing was about risk management, not rehabilitation. She told herself some kids weren't ready. She told herself she was being fair. But fair, she now understood, had become code. And code had become her blindness. That night, she didn't sleep. When she finally drifted off, the dream came in pieces. A courtroom, not her own, but cracked and dark, flickering lights, and silence. She sat on the bench, robe heavy, gavel in hand. But the room was filled, wall to wall, with children. All black, all silent. Not a word, not a cry, just eyes, hundreds of them. They stared at her, unblinking. And then, one by one, they began to speak. Not their own words, hers. Each child recited a phrase from her past rulings. A threat to his peers. Unlikely to benefit from diversion. Predictable outcome based on social circumstances. Her sentences, spoken back to her. Spoken by children she had sentenced without seeing. She tried to speak, to say something. Anything. But her mouth was sealed. She raised her gavel. It crumbled in her hand. She woke with a gasp, hand clutching her chest. The room was dim. The clock read 3:17 a.m. But there would be no more rest. She sat at her desk again, opened a file, then another, then another. Each one told the same story. A name, a charge, a sentence. And beneath the legal language patterns. Words repeated, labels reused. Risk, threat, likely to reoffend. But only in some files. In others, compassion, potential, redirection. And the faces in those files? They didn't look like Omari. They looked like Carter Williams. Like the boy who had been extended mercy because he reminded her of something, someone once close. And Omari? Omari had reminded her of no one. He had reminded her of everyone the system taught her to fear. She pressed her fingers to her temple. How had she not seen it? How many lives had she sentenced with blind conviction and selective empathy? Not because she hated them, but because she never tried to know them. It was worse than prejudice. It was indifference clothed in legal process. It was silence where there should have been listening. And she had called it justice. The knock on her door was soft. She startled, instinctively straightening her robe, forgetting she wasn't in court. Her clerk entered, a young woman named Rachel, no older than Omari. Rachel paused when she saw the expression on Whitmore's face. Pale, trembling. "Ma'am?" she asked, hesitantly. Whitmore tried to find her voice, but when it came, it cracked. "Pull my rulings," she whispered. Rachel blinked. "I'm sorry?" "All of them," Whitmore repeated, eyes wide. "Every juvenile sentence I've handed down in the last 20 years. Pull them. Organize them by race, by charge, by outcome." "Do it," she said, firmer now, "and don't file them under pending review. File them under self-audit." Rachel didn't move. Whitmore looked up at her, voice lower. "I need to see them," she said, "before the world does." In the hallway outside, a group of legal interns whispered over their phones. Word had leaked that a judge was requesting a full review of her own record, but none of them knew yet. It wasn't just for defense. It was for confession. The door clanged shut behind him with a finality that echoed down the corridor. Omari didn't flinch. He had heard the sound of judgment before, but never from steel. The holding cell was small, its cinder-block walls stained with time, and the weight of too many forgotten names. A fluorescent bulb flickered above, casting sickly yellow light on the metal bench where he now sat, wrists still sore from the cuffs that had been too tight for too long. The trial wasn't over, not technically, but public opinion had already spun it into a spectacle. And until the court decided how to proceed, or perhaps how to recover, Omari had been remanded into overnight custody. No bail, no warning. Just a holding pattern, they said. But to Omari, it was confirmation. The system didn't just fear him, it needed to contain him. Because something about a calm black boy who could quote the law shook their foundations harder than any riot. He leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes, blocking out the smell of bleach and old sweat. His mind didn't wander, it sharpened. It replayed each word he'd spoken, each paragraph, each pause. He wasn't looking for error. He was imprinting the experience, committing it to memory, not as trauma but as proof. Proof that he had survived it. When the guard brought his food, cold rice and a cube of meat that didn't look like anything meat should resemble, Omari didn't touch it. Hunger wasn't his need. Focus was. But paper, that was something he needed more than air. "Got a pen?" he asked. The guard, a lanky white man with pale freckles and a shaved head, raised a brow. "A pen. Just for a minute." The guard hesitated, then shrugged. "Only if I watch." Omari nodded. The guard handed him a napkin and a dull blue pen that had been cut in half for safety. Omari took both, turned sideways on the bench, and began to write. Not a letter, not a plea, a legal brief. He wrote as if the napkin were a courtroom. He began drafting a hypothetical amicus argument built around precedent, disproportionate sentencing, and implicit bias. The ink bled slightly, the fibers of the napkin resisting the pressure. But he didn't stop. When he reached the edge of one square, he asked for another. By the fourth napkin, the guard was no longer watching out of duty. He was watching out of curiosity. "You a lawyer?" he asked. Omari shook his head. Not yet. The guard stared at him for a long second. then walked away without another word. By morning, Omari had 3 full napkins and a half-filled fourth folded neatly beneath his shirt. The holding cell buzzed as other detainees came in and out. Some looked at him with curiosity, others ignored him, but it didn't take long for word to spread. One older man, thin and wiry with gray streaks in his beard, leaned over from a nearby bench. "You that kid from the news?" Omari looked up. "Yeah." The man whistled low. "Damn, you're the law boy." And that's what they started calling him. The law boy. Not mockingly, not with scorn, with respect. Even the men who had long ago been chewed up by the court, even they recognized something in Omari that unsettled the balance. He wasn't in there because he broke the law. He was in there because he understood it too well. And that made him dangerous. "You know," said a younger guy in the next cell, "if half the kids inside knew what you know, half this place would be empty." Omari didn't reply. He just kept writing. The napkins weren't for the court. They were for the next time. Because there would be a next time. Maybe not for him, but for someone else. Some other boy who walked the wrong street at the wrong hour with the wrong skin. And Omari was going to be ready. He was going to make sure no one walked into that courtroom blind again. Late in the afternoon, the cell door slid open again. A different guard this time. A black man in his 50s, salt and pepper stubble and tired eyes. He stepped in, holding something in his hand. "Graves." Omari looked up. The guard stepped closer, and without a word, slid something through the bars. It was a printout. Laser-cut paper, legal-sized. Omari reached for it cautiously. When he unfolded it, he saw the header. Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus Carter Williams, June 12, 2012. Her ruling. The entire ruling. Typed, printed, page numbered. Omari's breath caught. "How?" he asked. The guard just shrugged. "I got people in the building. Some folks, let's just say, think you're owed more than bars." Omari looked down at the paper. There it was. Everything she'd written. Not the quotes he memorized. The entire document. Her logic. Her justifications. Her empathy for someone who didn't look like him. He read it again. And this time, he didn't feel anger. He felt opportunity. He folded it with care, slid it into his waistband. The guard nodded once. Before he walked away, he muttered, "Keep reading, law boy." Omari didn't smile. He stared at the cement wall in front of him, eyes narrowed, and whispered, more to himself than anyone, "It's not over." In the next cell over, an inmate leaned close to the bars and whispered, "Yo, they moving your hearing up. They don't want you in here too long." Omari turned his head, slowly, eyes sharp. Ready. Courtroom 3B was full again. But it didn't feel the same. The room was no longer cloaked in silent obedience. There was an undercurrent now, not of rebellion, but of reckoning. The gallery was filled with unfamiliar faces, law professors, civil rights attorneys, students with notepads, and reporters with credentials swinging around their necks. Some had driven in from other counties, others had flown in from other states. Everyone was waiting for one thing. Would justice finally speak or continue hiding behind protocol? The courtroom door opened. Omari entered in clean clothes, freshly ironed, no handcuffs this time. His posture was as it always had been, composed, deliberate, unshaken. His mother sat in the front row, her face unreadable, but her hands trembling in her lap. This time she hadn't come alone. Behind her were families of those who had been sentenced by Whitmore over the years. A woman in a nurse's uniform, a man with 2 boys by his side, an old woman holding a photo of someone who should have been there but wasn't. And when Judge Whitmore entered, the entire courtroom seemed to brace itself. She walked slower than usual. Her robe looked heavier. Her expression wasn't cold, it was fractured. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and looked at the docket. Her voice, when it came, was softer than anyone remembered. "This court is now back in session, in the matter of Commonwealth versus Omari Graves." She looked up at him, not down at him. A beat passed before she spoke again. "Before we proceed, I wish to acknowledge a motion filed by the prosecution this morning." The new prosecutor, a younger black woman named Ayanna Pierce, stood calmly beside the state's table. She wasn't here for politics. She was here for principle. Pierce addressed the judge clearly. "Your Honor, the Commonwealth moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Graves with prejudice." The room gasped. Pierce continued. "After reviewing the case, including the arrest footage which has since resurfaced, the officer's statements, and the circumstances surrounding the alleged possession, the state finds insufficient grounds to proceed with prosecution. Further, we believe continuing this trial would serve neither justice nor the community's trust in this court. It wasn't just a dismissal. It was an indictment of the system, of the assumptions, of everything that had led to this boy being inside a courtroom in the first place.
Whitmore stared at the prosecutor for a long moment.
Then nodded. "So ordered," she said quietly. "The case is dismissed. Charges are hereby dropped." There was no gavel slam. No applause. Just stillness, as if no one believed it was real yet. Then Whitmore looked at Omari, and the moment that followed didn't feel like a ruling. It felt like a confession. "I watched your testimony again," she said. "Not as a judge, as a person." Omari said nothing. She swallowed hard, trying to stay composed. "I failed to see your humanity," she said. "Not because it wasn't there, but because I didn't look for it. I made assumptions based on years of fear, not facts. I used words I've used before, words that were never supposed to mean harm, but they did, to you, and to others who sat where you sit." A tear slipped from the corner of her eye. She blinked hard, her voice quivering. "In all my years on this bench, I have never cried in court." The gallery held its breath. "And today," she said, "I do." A ripple of stunned silence moved through the room. She continued, slower now, more vulnerable than the courtroom had ever seen her. "Justice is not just law. It is listening. And I stopped listening long ago. You made me hear again." Her voice cracked at the edges. "You didn't just defend yourself, Mr. Graves. You defended every voice this courtroom didn't know how to hear." The tears came now, unguarded. A woman who had always been iron, now undone by a boy she once saw as just another case. Omari didn't blink, didn't move, didn't smile. He looked at her as if he had known this moment would come. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Even you heard yourself finally." That was all. The courtroom didn't erupt. There was no standing ovation. Just a deep collective exhale, like something ancient had just been broken open and released. Judge Whitmore nodded, more to herself than to him. She folded her hands and said nothing more. As the clerk prepared to close the docket, Whitmore whispered to her assistant, "There's something else I need to do, off the record." Her fingers tightened around the gavel, not to strike it, to give it away. The court clerk closed the file. Omari didn't speak. He didn't rise right away. There was no dramatic exit, no final turn to the gallery. He just sat, quiet and steady, as if absorbing the weight of what had happened, not only for him, but for everyone who had ever sat in that chair with truth on their tongue and judgment in their shadow. When he finally stood, the room rose with him, not ceremonially, reverently. Even Judge Whitmore remained seated, her gavel untouched, her eyes wet. Omari stepped out of courtroom 3B, not as a free boy, but as something else entirely. A signal, a rupture, a spark. And outside those doors, that spark met oxygen. The first legal analysis came just 2 days later, in an op-ed published in the New York Law Review, titled "Precedent as Protest: The Legal Genius of Omari Graves." The author, a black law professor from Howard, wrote, "Graves did not challenge the system with fury or fists, but with familiarity. He dismantled bias not by rejecting the law but by reciting it, and in doing so he illuminated its most dangerous flaw, selective silence." That piece went viral among academic circles, shared by law professors from Yale, Columbia, and Stanford. Soon it made its way to the inboxes of civil rights attorneys, and from there to legislators. In Philadelphia, a coalition of public defenders, activists, and legal scholars convened within a week. Their mission: take what had happened in 3B and turn it into lasting structure. They called it the Omari Initiative, a blueprint for reforming how juvenile cases are handled when race, class, and judicial discretion intersect. At the heart of it was a proposal, a bill that would require mandatory judicial audits on sentencing disparities by race, restorative justice hearings as a default for first-time juvenile offenders, accessible case data to ensure public oversight of judicial trends, bias training for all juvenile court judges and staff. They drafted the legislation in under a month. The working title was clunky: the Juvenile Equity and Rehabilitation Act, but everyone called it what it was: the Omari Act. Omari didn't know at first. He was back at school, trying to fade into routine. The halls of Langston Prep felt the same: linoleum floors, buzzing lights, too many lockers, too few hours of sleep. But the way people looked at him had changed. Not like a hero, like a symbol. He hated it. He was called to the principal's office 3 times in the first week. Not for discipline, for interviews, for reflections, for journalists who wanted to stand in the hallway where the law boy had once walked. He refused them all. One afternoon, his principal, a tall woman named Miss Kendrick, knocked gently on his classroom door. "Omari," she said, "can I speak with you?" He followed her down the hall, wondering if he'd forgotten to submit an assignment. Instead, she handed him a manila folder. Inside, a photocopy of the drafted bill. He stared at it, read the title, read his name in the footnotes. "This is real?" he asked. Miss Kendrick nodded. "They're voting next session." He didn't speak. She looked at him, then said, "You may not want to be a symbol, Omari, but sometimes the system needs one." He closed the folder gently, eyes sharp. "I don't want to be the reason it starts," he said. "I want to be the reason it never happens again." When the bill hit the state floor, the reaction was instant and divided. Some senators scoffed, another liberal attempt at coddling youth. Others embraced it as necessary disruption. But it wasn't the politicians that carried it through the storm. It was the people. Families whose children had been sentenced without context. Teens who had watched Omari's courtroom moment on YouTube a dozen times, each time seeing a bit more of themselves in his posture. Law students who had clipped his quotes and tacked them on their dorm walls. And eventually one unexpected voice emerged in support, Judge Marlene Whitmore. In a rare public statement, one that circulated across legal news, she wrote,
The law should not fear revision. When justice reveals its fault lines, we must not patch them quietly. We must rebuild.
Her words didn't absolve her, but they helped. The bill passed committee, then passed the state house, then, to the shock of many, passed the Senate. On July 6th, it was signed into law. The Omari Act was now real. And across courtrooms in Pennsylvania, and soon other states, it began to change how justice was rendered. Not completely, but enough to matter. 3 months later, at Penn Law School, a new syllabus was released for the Juvenile Justice Seminar. On page 2, under landmark modern cases, right below Roper v. Simmons, was Commonwealth Verdict Graves, 2025. Topic: Precedent, Bias and Courtroom Reflection as Legal Strategy. Omari didn't know until a former clerk from Whitmore's office, now attending that class, sent him a screenshot with the message. "Your case law now." He stared at it for a long time. Not smiling, just processing. One evening, Nina came home from work, her shoes muddy, her back sore. She opened the fridge, found leftovers, then saw something taped to the wall beside the calendar. A printed rendering. A sketch of a statue. She turned and found Omari on the couch.
What's this?
"They're planning something downtown," he said. "Planning what?" He turned the tablet toward her. It showed a bronze figure, tall, still, with an open book in one hand, and a scale in the other. But unlike traditional Lady Justice statues, this one wasn't blindfolded. It had ears, and beneath it, a plaque. "Justice must listen," dedicated to every voice silenced before it spoke. Nina's hand trembled on the page. Her voice cracked. "That's not you?" Omari shook his head. "It's not me." She furrowed her brow. He looked up. "It's all of us." That night, while the city slept and statues were being planned, Omari received a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a note. "You gave me back my voice. Now I'm giving you this." Taped to the page was Whitmore's gavel. The grand rotunda of the state courthouse had never felt more solemn. There were no banners, no music, no ceremonial gavels polished for show. Just a sea of suited attendees, many standing silently with folded programs, unsure of whether they were gathered to celebrate or reckon. The podium stood at the center, flanked by flags and framed by the courthouse's marble columns. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras steady, eyes sharp. Even now, in the final hours of her long judicial career, Marlene Whitmore commanded a room. But today wasn't about authority. It was about accountability. When the doors opened, and she entered, not in her black robe, but in a dark gray suit, there was a shift in the air. She walked slowly, her gait slightly stiff, her face unreadable. The whispers in the crowd softened as she approached the stage. Some people stood, others remained seated. Everyone watched. She reached the podium, adjusted the mic, and waited. The silence held. Then she spoke, and her voice cracked, not from age but from weight. "Thank you for coming." She didn't open with pleasantries. No legal jargon, no list of achievements, only the truth. "I've stood behind benches, robes, and gavels for over 3 decades. I've sentenced murderers, comforted victims, and navigated the gray fog of law where truth and belief don't always meet. but I've also made mistakes. She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. I'm retiring today, not because I'm tired, and not because of pressure, though both exist, but because silence is no longer an option I can live with. The crowd murmured, gently. I want to be clear, she continued. This is not a resignation in disgrace. This is a step away to make space for better clarity, better justice, and better voices. A pause. And because it took a boy to teach me the law again. The words landed like a dropped gavel. From the third row, Omari sat motionless, his hands folded, head slightly bowed. He wasn't hidden. He hadn't been invited as a symbol. He had been asked to come, personally. Whitmore had written the letter herself. I forgot, she said, voice shaking, that justice is not a sound we issue from the bench. It is a silence we agree to break. I forgot that rulings are not just words, they are lives. The crowd grew quieter. I wrote opinions that sounded fair but were rooted in fear. I handed down sentences that fit the crime but not the child. I read the law but didn't always see the person behind it. Her jaw tightened. And then a boy stood in front of me, calm, educated, and he recited my own ruling, word for word, with more grace than I deserved. Whitmore looked down at her notes, then set them aside. I had written those words over a decade ago. I'd used them to justify leniency for someone who reminded me of my grandson, someone I believed in. But when another boy, smarter, stronger, and darker, stood in the same space, I saw a threat instead of a future. She looked out at the crowd again. That boy showed me that I had lost my ear for justice, and more dangerously, I'd thought I was still listening. She paused, breathing deeply. It is one thing to misjudge a case. It is another to misjudge a soul. I've done both. Her hands gripped the podium. You want legacy? Fine. Let this be it. A warning that no matter how high the bench, no matter how sacred the robe, we are never above bias, and we are never beneath correction. Some people began to tear up. Others simply nodded, solemnly. I've spent most of my life writing the law, but it took a 17-year-old to read it back to me in a way I could finally hear. She turned slightly toward Omari and smiled, faintly. He didn't accuse me. He didn't scream. He simply became the law I forgot how to honor. A long pause followed. Then she reached down into a small wooden box beside the podium. Inside was her gavel. Polished, familiar. She held it in her hand for a moment, running her thumb along the worn handle. This gavel, she said, holding it up, has ruled over thousands of lives. Some I protected, others I failed. It has been an extension of my power, but rarely of my humility. She stepped down from the podium, walked slowly toward the front row. Omari stood, quietly, sensing the moment before it arrived. Whitmore approached him. I don't know what your future holds, she said, her voice soft, private. But if you ever choose to lead, lead with this. She handed him the gavel, and for a moment they simply stood there, not as judge and defendant, not as symbols, but as two people changed by the collision of truth and time. Omari took the gavel without ceremony, without a speech, without pride, just a nod, and silence. Outside, reporters scrambled to capture the image, the gavel passing from the hands of power to the hands of change. But inside, the moment belonged to no camera. It belonged to memory. That evening, back at home, Omari placed the gavel on his desk beside a new envelope he hadn't yet opened. On it was a seal from Harvard Law School. He stared at it, then reached for the letter opener, his hand brushing the gavel as he did. The envelope sat on his desk for hours. Omari didn't rush to open it, not out of fear, but reverence. The moment didn't need haste, it needed pause. It wasn't just paper, it was legacy. When he finally sliced it open with the edge of an old bookmark, his hands didn't shake. He unfolded the letter, read the words slowly, words most people never see in a lifetime. We are pleased to offer you full admission to Harvard College, class of 2030. A separate page confirmed it, a full scholarship, room tuition, books. The gavel sat beside him, reflecting soft light from the desk lamp. He didn't grin. He exhaled. Deep, measured. Nina found him that way. Still, letter in one hand, gavel in the other. Let me guess, she said softly. He nodded. She leaned against the doorframe, tears already forming. I used to read to you about Thurgood Marshall, she said. Remember? Omari nodded again. Back then, she said, I didn't know I was raising one. He didn't correct her. Because deep down, he knew she hadn't raised a legend. She had raised a mirror, and now the system had to look into it. The news broke quietly. No press conference, No parade. Just a captioned photo shared by Langston Prep. From our halls to Harvard Law, congratulations, Omari Graves. But it didn't stay quiet for long. News outlets picked it up. The headline wrote itself. The teen who challenged a judge now walks the same path as Marshall. But the story wasn't about prestige. It was about intention. When Harvard asked for his essay, Omari didn't write about the courtroom. He wrote about strategy. I'm not going to law school to change the law, he wrote. I'm going to understand the playbook, so the next time a courtroom tries to silence someone like me, I won't need to quote anyone else's ruling, I'll write my own. Cambridge greeted him with sharp winds and heavy books. The campus buzzed with ambition, but Omari moved through it with quiet precision. He took notes on every syllabus. He sat in the front row of every lecture, and when a professor quoted a landmark case, Omari didn't just nod. He knew the footnotes by heart. His peers called him the architect. Because while others debated theory, Omari mapped systems. Bias wasn't abstract to him. It was a lived algorithm, coded into policy, and he had the receipts to prove it. One day, in a constitutional law seminar, a guest lecturer, a Supreme Court justice, asked the class, "What's the most powerful tool a defendant has in court?" Omari raised his hand. "Memory," he said. The justice blinked. "Explain." "If you remember what the court forgot," Omari said, "you can bring it back to the bench, even if you have to speak it from the defendant's chair." Back home, the Omari Act was reshaping juvenile policy. Training programs, racial equity audits. A pilot program in 4 counties had already cut first-time detention by 40%. Civil rights firms began calling him during his second semester. Clerks, advisors, mentors. They all wanted to help him get placed. But Omari wasn't looking to climb. He was looking to return. During a winter break, he flew home. The city felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. Still, it welcomed him. At the airport, an older woman stopped him near baggage claim. "You're the boy from court," she said. He nodded politely. She reached into her purse, pulled out a wrinkled envelope. "My nephew's inside," she whispered, "charged with something he didn't do. They don't listen to us." Omari took the envelope gently. "They will," he said. That week he made time for only one formal appointment. A visit to courtroom 3B. It had been repainted. The walls were now a warm beige instead of cold gray. The judge's bench had been sanded and softened. The benches replaced with wider seating. But the air still carried memory. He stepped inside alone, walked to the defense table, ran his fingers across the edge, the same one he'd leaned on. He closed his eyes. He could still hear the echo. "Sit down, boy." Then, is justice still blind or just selectively mute? He opened his eyes. The courtroom was empty, but he spoke anyway. Softly, "To everyone who ever sat here and wasn't heard, I did." Outside on the marble steps, he sat for a while, gavel in his backpack, journal in his lap. He wrote a single line. "You don't need a robe to deliver justice, just memory and a voice." He closed the book and stood. That night, as he boarded the train back to campus, a security officer approached quietly, handing him a folded note someone had left behind on the platform. In tidy script it read, "When you're ready to build the next courtroom, let me know. J.W. Whitmore." The courtroom has always been a stage. And for far too long, in America, it has staged a very specific performance. Decorum wrapped around disparity. Authority camouflaging assumption. A black defendant steps forward, and the room adjusts itself, not out of fear, but out of centuries-old choreography. A pause here, a raised brow there, a lowered expectation that no one writes down but everyone reads. Omari's story didn't begin with him, and it wouldn't end with him either, because the bench he stood before was built on bones. In 1955, Emmett Till never got a courtroom. He got a casket. He got whispers, headlines, and then silence decades of it. The justice system never spoke his name in trial. His killers never saw a day behind bars. And when the system failed him, it didn't apologize, it adjusted, quietly. In 1989, 5 black and brown boys in Central Park, Corey, Yusef, Antron, Kevin, Raymond, were dragged into a nightmare disguised as due process. They were interrogated, coerced, convicted, imprisoned. It took years, a confession, DNA evidence, outrage, and finally, release. But the scars stayed. Not just on their records, on the system that pretended they were outliers when in fact they were just another example. Trayvon, Khalif, Tamir, Sandra, Philando. They weren't all court cases. Some were tombstones. But each one left a ripple, a memory, a sentence left unfinished in the mouth of a nation. Then came Omari. Different, yes, but part of the same timeline. Same courtroom logic. Same expectation of guilt before words were spoken. He just did what others weren't given the chance to do. He spoke back. Not with fists, not even with fire. With memory. He took the system's own words and made them audible again when everyone had gotten used to ignoring them. Years after his trial, Omari's name began appearing not just in news but in curriculum. Criminal law courses. Bias seminars. Public speaking modules on how courtroom tone reflects institutional prejudice. At Columbia, a legal ethics professor played his courtroom audio and asked his class, "Is this justice, or just restraint, waiting for permission?" In a civics class in Atlanta, a 14-year-old black girl wrote in her paper, "Omari Graves didn't just know the law, he believed it should believe in him." The gavel he'd been given by Judge Whitmore, once a private symbol, was now replicated in woodshops across community centers. Not as weapons, as reminders. Because justice isn't blind. It just needs to be reminded to see. But the road was still long. And uneven. Because for every reform, there was a reversal. For every newly trained judge, there was another elected by rhetoric, not reason. Some courts resisted transparency. Some police departments buried data. Some voices still called kids like Omari too articulate, as if intelligence were suspicious on a black tongue. But the difference now? Those boys weren't alone. They were citing precedent. And for the first time in a long time, the precedent wasn't from the 1960s. It was from a teenager in Pennsylvania. Omari didn't chase the spotlight. He graduated from Harvard, declined offers from top firms, and returned to the city he once stood trial in. Not for revenge. For re-architecture. He founded a nonprofit, Recite Justice. It trained youth, especially black and brown students, to understand courtroom language, to read judicial rulings, to know what words to look for, and which ones to speak when systems try to fold them into silence. He didn't make them lawyers. He made them literate in survival. And then in power. One day, during a youth seminar, a boy no older than 16 raised his hand. "If the judge is the most powerful person in the room," he asked, "how do you stop them from being wrong?" Omari didn't blink. "You don't stop them," he said. "You remind them they can be." In a dusty courtroom in North Carolina, a young black teen stood before a skeptical judge. He'd been accused of trespassing on a property he'd lived on just a year before. The new owners had called the police. No one asked why he'd returned. No one asked how he felt. He stood with hands shaking slightly, lips dry. But he had something under his arm. A thin paperback book. On the cover, "Precedent and Power, the Language of Justice," by Omari Graves. He opened it, marked a page, and began to speak. The judge paused mid-sentence, brow furrowed. And the boy said softly, "Your Honor, I know what comes next. I read the pattern. If this story moved you, if it made you think deeper about justice, about silence, about what it really means to be heard, then don't let it stop here. Subscribe to this channel for more powerful stories that expose truths, uplift black voices, and challenge systems that too often go unchecked. And if you believe stories like Omari's deserve to be heard, not just once, but again and again, then like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and let this echo grow. Because justice doesn't end with a verdict. It begins with memory, and you help carry that forward.